Welcome everybody to the January SciCafe. Today we have Dr. Steve Leitman. He's going to be talking about providing freshwater inflow to the Apalachicola Estuary. Steve has worked on the Apalachicola River system for over 40 years in many capacities. He works for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He also works on the Apalachicola Bay Systems Initiative project that's working to restore Apalachicola Bay. And today he's going to talk to us about some of the modeling he's doing that might give us more input into the system. So we also have, unfortunately, Steve's camera is not working, but we have Alicia. Alicia, you want to turn on your camera real quick? Alicia is
Hello.
Alicia Bruno, works with me, and she's our producer for today. So Steve, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Okay, well, lucky you guys, you don't get to see my face. Anyway, my role right now working with the Apalachicola Bay Systems Initiative is to focus on that freshwater inflow to the Apalachicola Estuary. And it's a larger project associated with looking at trying to recover the Apalachicola Bay seafood industry. And in this position, my responsibilities are what I have to first understand how much water historically has flowed into the estuary. Then what's the relationship between humans, management actions, and the water? What is the capacity of the storage reservoirs in the system to augment flow? And then asking questions as we look to the future. Should we expect different flow in terms of volume and or timing of flow? And what's the relationship between freshwater inflow and ecological sustainability of the estuary? So pretty complicated role. I'm glad I had 40 years to get ready for it. So looking at the Apalachicola system, one of the things to understand in Florida really needs to know well is that the majority of our water comes from Georgia and Alabama in the Apalachicola River. And this is simply because the majority of the drainage that feeds the river is in Georgia and Alabama. And in looking at this map, you can see that there's two large river basins that meet to form the Apalachicola, one being the Flint on the right in green, and one being the Chattahoochee in purple on the left. And although they're comparable in size, there's a lot of differences between the two basins. The first being is that in looking in the Chattahoochee side, you have storage capacity, and that the Corps of Engineers has built multiple dams that have a capacity to store water, being Buford Dam, West Point Dam, and George are the ones that have storage. There's minimal storage at the border at Woodruff. And although there's a dam at Andrews, it's a flow-through dam or a run-of-the-river dam. And another major difference between the two basins is that on the Flint side, there's a large groundwater contribution to flow, whereas on the Chattahoochee side, there's some, but not near to the extent that there is in the Flint side. So freshwater inflow from the ACF basin is important to the estuary because, first of all, it defines the salinity regime, which is important in defining the ecosystem structure. Second, it delivers nutrients to the estuary via both the inundation of the floodplain and from upstream, and it also moderates temperature in the estuary. So my evaluations that I do in the basin are being done through a river basin model, which was developed in a STELLA format. This model was originally developed back in the 1990s as part of the ACF Basin Comprehensive Study. And I became familiar with it. And then I also started to believe that having more than one model in the basin is a good idea, because that way they can cross-check each other, and different models will have different attributes that they can do well. So I don't necessarily view multiple models as being competitive as well. They're more collaborative. But the model that I use, I put in the time in working with Fish and Wildlife Service and with the Corps, and we calibrated them to make sure that we get comparable values if we have comparable inflow and management strategy going on, comparable withdrawals, so that what I produce from my model is comparable to what the Corps would get with theirs. And this is an important issue, because if we're going to go and look and tell the Corps a better way that they can manage something, it's important that it's not in the model, but it's actually that it's the same modeling approach that they're doing roughly, and it comes up with the same information. So the default settings that I have in my model emulate right now the current water control manual operations, which was adopted in 2016. But within the model, I have great capacity to change reservoir operations, consumptive demands, and climate, and ask how those would affect inflow to the estuary. And the model that I use has a very fast runtime. At like 15 seconds, I can run the 74-year period of record that we have. And so that allows me to do a lot of experimentation and ask a lot of questions. And the water control manual that we spoke of is just simply the Corps of Engineers guidelines for managing the storage reservoirs as a system. So each individual reservoir has a manual, and then they have a manual for all of them together and how they operate it as a larger system. And then the output from the model is just 74-year data set of flow and reservoir elevations at selected locations. And so on this map, you can see the locations of where we have it. So we can ask questions and get output. Now, this is where it gets tricky, is flow and elevation does not really help that. It helps, but it does not address the question of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable for management operations. And to do this, you need to develop a set of performance metrics to translate flow volumes into criteria which society can use to define as acceptable or not acceptable. To simply say that flow should be more than a certain volume is really not adequate. You need to consider a lot more than magnitude when asking about flow questions. You need to include timing, frequency, duration of events, or elevations. And when I taught a class, I was teaching at FSU on reservoir management, river management, and I liken it to having a fever. If you have a fever of 102 degrees for a couple hours and then it goes back down, it's one thing. If you have a fever of 102 degrees and it lasts for 2 weeks, that's a completely different thing. If you keep having fevers of 102 degrees over and over and over again, that's different. And if you have a fever of 102 degrees right before you're going to do something like go on vacation, it's a whole lot different than if you have it before you're supposed to go out and do yard work. So metrics need to reflect societal priorities for managing the watershed. They should be accessible, they should be understandable to stakeholders, and they should be subject to changing over time because societal priorities change over time. So an example of a performance metric could be the number of days that flow is below a certain threshold during a specific time of year. For instance, what if the number of days that flow would be below a 6,500 CFS or cubic feet per second flow, which is a low flow in the Apalachicola, say from June to October during the period when you have low flow season. And that would be an example. I'm not saying we should or shouldn't use that. So based on the ongoing ABSI research, we're working on trying to develop metrics related to oyster larval distribution, to salinity, and other factors related to river inflow. And I'm also collaborating with the RCSC to develop metrics related to the floodplain. And it really should be understood by everyone that during both the Supreme Court lawsuit, which went on for years, and in the compact negotiations, having such metrics, and especially a set of metrics that were agreed to by the principal parties involved, did not exist. They were not defined. And so you had people trying to negotiate what was good without a definition of good. And it'd be kind of like going out to dinner to a restaurant and nobody said what kind of food you're going to get, but you want to know when you're going to get to the restaurant. And it really doesn't work. And so my personal belief is that some of the problems that we've experienced with trying to work out these issues has been an absence of an agreement on what do we call good management and how do we define it specifically. Now, in they developed the water control manual, the Corps of Engineers did develop a set of metrics, but in my opinion, these metrics really were not that satisfactory, and that they were developed internally within the Corps and they weren't coordinated. And I go back to that, I think it's important that metrics be accessible and be understandable and agreed to by the people that have a stake in the outcome of imposing these metrics on them. So in looking at the capacity of the ACF basin, we have a kind of an anomaly going on. If you look first at these jars represent the volume of storage that you have at the different reservoirs. And what you can see is that the largest jar is in the top of the basin and the smallest jar is at the bottom. And the problem that you run into is that the way a reservoir gets refilled is that the water flows from upstream into the reservoirs. And so rain that falls in the Flint Basin or falls in the Chattahoochee Basin below Buford Dam does not refill Lake Lanier unless you wish to pump the water back up into Lake Lanier, which could be costly and not the best idea. And so the problem we have is that, first of all, one side of this basin has really no management capacity, being the Flint. And then on the other side, roughly 2/3 of your storage capacity to manage flows is in the upper part of the basin. There is some storage at West Point and George, but Lanier has those refill issues, and Lanier also serves as part of the drinking water supply for Metro Atlanta. So the problem we have in managing this basin is this issue that we tend to not have the flow, the reservoirs where they could make a big difference and where they could refill easily. So important questions that I have to ask in this process is, what is the capacity of the reservoir system to manage flow? And what are the boundaries that define acceptable reservoir management? So for instance, emptying reservoir storage is not a good idea. Not only are you jeopardizing the water supply for Metro Atlanta, when you're in the middle of a drought, you do not know how long that drought will occur. So one of the things that I did a number of years ago is when we had that severe drought in 2012 and 11, I went back and looked and said, could we have managed our way out of that drought through either different or better management of the reservoirs or through reduced consumptive demands? And in looking at what we found is that you could severely lower the storage in the reservoirs you would have had flows comparable to that in the 2007 instead of the 11-12 drought, which still caused significant problems for Apalachicola Bay. And if the drought had persisted longer, you had a big problem. So there's a certain boundary that we really need to understand, and we need to make sure that with the reservoirs that you're able to deal with the unknown and you're able to deal with a drought of undefined intensity or duration. And another example is that in managing the reservoirs is you don't want to cause severe damage, ecological damage to the estuary. And so it's this working out the boundaries of what is acceptable, again, goes right back to that question of that we really need to put the work in to define metrics of what is acceptable over time. Now, one of the things with the water control manual that really needs to be understood, and I don't think is understood that well, is that what this manual does is it defines the minimum level of support the reservoirs in the Chattahoochee River can supply to Jim Woodruff outflow. It does not necessarily define what the outflow from Jim Woodruff would be, because that outflow is dependent also on inflow from the Flint and inflow from the Chattahoochee below Walter F. George. And minimum releases from Jim Woodruff Dam are often greater than those that would be supported under the water control manual, even in drought operations. And you can have a condition where you're still in drought operations, which calls for a minimum flow of 5,000 CFS, but Walter F. George and West Point are full. There's water coming down the Flint, and the cumulative sum of that water is far greater than 5,000. And so that goes back to that what that water control manual does is it doesn't say how much water. We don't have that level of control of the water in the basin. And so what it does is it says the flow will at least be that much, not it will be that much, period. Now, I have a number of problems with the current water control plan. One of the first ones is that the manual does not account for the flow needs of the Apalachicola Estuary. When the Corps of Engineers was developing projects in this basin, they developed a navigation-oriented project, which also deals with flood control, water supply, hydropower, and other issues in the ACF basin. And then they also developed the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway. The Apalachicola Bay is part of the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway. The Apalachicola River is a separate project. And the boundaries do not extend into Apalachicola Bay. As a result, when they were working out how best to manage the Apalachicola River, considerations of the freshwater inflow to the estuary was not part of the calculus that was used to figure out the best alternative. They are ecologically connected, that's undeniable, but nevertheless, as this historical artifact of the two of them and the way they were created resulted in this disparity. Another issue that I have with the water control manual is that it was predominantly based on the historical climate, which occurred from 1939 to 2012. Now, that's 74 years of data, which sounds like a lot, but the thing is that the flow that occurred from 1939 to 2012 was just one of many, many ways that flow could have occurred. And if you're doing an analysis basing it just on the historical flow, you're actually asking the question of how should have we managed the basin in the past, not how should we be managing it in the future. It is more than likely that in the future, we're going to see droughts of greater extent, floods of greater extent, droughts in different timings, different durations, different frequencies. And I'm about to submit a paper for publication where what we did is we looked at the water control manual operations, and we looked at 100 variations in the way historical climate could have happened, which was done through a simulation model, and then entered those simulations into the STELLA model and said, this is how it would result in reservoir elevations and in flows and such. And surprise, if you tune a reservoir system to manage in one climate, it won't necessarily do as well in a different climate. And it's, I like using analogies, and I would say that this is really comparable to you're living in Denver and you have your car tuned, and then you move down to the coast and your car doesn't run so well because it was tuned to run in one set of conditions, and you're not living in those conditions. And so a very interesting question to ask is, will operations called for under the manual work well in climate conditions different from those in the 39 to 2012 period of record? So the question that I have is, where do we go from here in the present? And what I conclude first is that Florida really needs to do the work necessary to define metrics to distinguish between what's acceptable and unacceptable to us. And in defining these metrics, you should definitely have stakeholders involved. They should definitely be tied to research and questions, and they should be able to be changed over time as we learn more. But we need to define what acceptable means to us. Once these are developed, I think we need to go back and look at the water control manual relative to metrics, both for the Florida part and for the Georgia and Alabama parts, and develop a good set of metrics that defines what the stakeholders in the basin consider acceptable and what can be done about it from here. Next, we need to look at current operations in a range of climates beyond what was experienced in 39 to 2012, with an emphasis on varying magnitudes, frequencies, durations, and timing of extreme events. And last, I think that the effect of management on the estuaries is a legitimate issue and should be incorporated into how we manage the reservoir systems. And with that, I would like to open up for questions, and I'm willing to listen to questions as long as people want to ask them, and I will try my best to answer them. Hello?
Yeah, we're giving people a moment. I kind of have one question. So is there any movement on the part of Florida to start establishing the metrics? What would be your first suggestion to start the process?
Well, I am working both with the RCSC in defining some metrics for the floodplain, and with ABSI, we're working to define metrics for the bay.
Yeah, you're breaking up a little, Steve.
Okay, well, I don't know what to do.
Yeah, it just might have been the moment. We're used to internet that comes and goes, so if you might restate that, that would be great. But
I would really, when they first talked about modeling with the ACF, Apalachicola Chattahoochee Flint Stakeholder Group, I had really tried to get them to focus a lot more on metrics. And they did come up with a list of metrics, but I think we could do better. And I think that getting stakeholders throughout the basin to really focus on a good set of metrics so that we know system-wide what we're trying to do would be good.
How do citizens get to use the USACE to consider the needs of the Apalachicola Bay as part of the navigation project for the river?
How do they do that? Could you ask that question again, please?
Okay. How do citizens get the USACE to consider the needs of the Apalachicola Bay as part of the navigation project, the river?
Well, I would think you would need more than citizens to do that. I think that's something that would go up to at a state level, that having the state and the congressional people in the state saying that this needs to congressionally be considered as part of how you evaluate it. And when you make considerations of how to manage the reservoir system, that Apalachicola Bay is part of the Apalachicola Chattahoochee Basin. But I think that's more of a political question than a science question or a hydrology question.
Have you, I'll ask one while we're waiting. Steve, have you had any interactions with the Corps? Are they interested in the modeling you're doing?
Absolutely, I have interactions with the Corps, and part of my interactions with the modeling that I'm doing came about that when the Fish and Wildlife Service developed their biological opinion, I had approached them and talked to them about the concept that instead of having the Corps do all the modeling, why don't they set up to internally have the modeling where I would handle the modeling for them? And so that if they had questions, they didn't have to ask the Corps and wait for a response, but we could do it ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So as a result, when they developed the biological opinion, the analysis was based on modeling done in STELLA, not through the course model, which gave us the flexibility to be proactive and say, this is what we'd like to see you do. This is the change we'd like to see you do. And they could check it in their model, which was fine. And I think having multiple tools to do that is a good way to do it. But I think that you don't want to put yourself where they have a special tool that we don't have access to.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, Georgia Ackerman has her hand up. I'm going to take her off mute.
I'm not sure if you can hear me or not. I'm working off.
We can hear you now.
Oh, yay. Steve,
Hi,
thank you for the excellent presentation. I just thought it would be helpful to ask if you're familiar with how frequently the Corps updates the water control manual.
That's an interesting question, but it's supposed to be coming back every 5 years, and they're talking about reopening it up, with Fish and Wildlife Services talking to them about reopening it up. But before that, we were in a period with a lot of litigation and everything. And I think that the previous actual one that went through the whole process was only in the 1950s.
Correct. That's my understanding too.
And then they came out with, in 1988, 89, they came out with a proposal for a second one, which almost led to an interstate lawsuit and started the whole water wars, where they wanted to reallocate water at Lake Lanier, and they also came up with a proposal of how they wanted to manage the basin. And so it's been erratic. And I think that from a personal standpoint, I think that the timing of the last update in the middle of the Supreme Court lawsuit put the state of Florida in a rather awkward position. Because Florida was putting a lot of its resources towards the lawsuit, which meant that when the water control manual came out, that they didn't have staff or time to do both. And so Florida was not as involved as they would have been if it would have been at another time. So it would be nice to revisit it and have the full resources of the state focusing in on it, and have everyone just saying, what's the best way to manage this system? and how do we want to do it? Does that answer your question, Georgia?
Yes, thank you. I thought it'd be helpful for folks to hear that. Thank you.
Okay.
It's definitely a good point, Steve. A lot of the people who were working with the state, employees of the state, were also trying not to impact the case by making comments. So I think you're right. That's something that probably we need to look at again.
Well, I think that we have the tools and the understanding to be able to do this, making it happen.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Any other comments? This webinar is recorded, so it is a lot of information, but I think Steve did a great job presenting it. And it will be recorded, and we'll send you out a link to that recording. Steve, did you have any other points you wanted to make?
Well, I would note there's a couple other interesting questions going on. And one is I saw Paul Thurman is on it, and I know that the Water Management District is looking into the question of when you get down to around the Pinhook, you have the Jackson River and you have flow going back and forth into Lake Wimico. And I think we're just at the early stages of getting a better handle on what's actually going on down there.
Yeah, we actually are going to have Paul hopefully talk in, I believe we talked about May. So, and give an update on what they're seeing with those flow meters that they've installed. Definitely interested in hearing more about that.
And so that's an interesting question in terms of freshwater inflow to the bay. That is something fairly recent and fairly topical.
Yes. Steve, we thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. And as I mentioned, it is recorded and available through a link on our website. And thank you for joining us for the SciCafe. We are skipping February because we have a research symposium on the 23rd and 24th here at the reserve. Everybody's invited to attend either in person or virtually. So we hope you will attend that. And Steve will actually be speaking the first day of the symposium. And then we have, in March, we'll have Beth Appleton on March 23rd. And we're doing an exhibit with Beth here at the Research Reserve, and she'll be doing a talk on that. So
Hi, Beth.
if that's on the call too. So definitely a lot of good points made here. And we really appreciate your time, Steve, and everybody who attended. All right, well, thank you very much.
Okay.